Make me co-host before you.
I will do so. All right. First of all, I'd like to say welcome to our, what month are we in? June webinar. Our focus is on equitable practices for grading, particularly, and assessment. Our speaker today is Laura Boyle, Dr. Laura Boyle, who is at, how do I say that, Joliet?
Joliet.
Joliet
Mm.
Central High School in Joliet, Illinois. Dr. Boyle is a recent graduate from the University of South Carolina's Educational Practice and Innovation Program with a STEM concentration. She has 15 years of experience teaching life science courses, including biology, environmental science, and anatomy. She taught for 8 years in Chicago Public Schools and has spent the last 7 years at Joliet Central High School. All of her experiences at a Title I school, serving students who are traditionally underrepresented in STEM fields. She has been working to implement equitable grading practices in her classroom for nearly 10 years and completed her dissertation on the impact of equitable grading practices on student outcomes and biology self-efficacy, which I can say was fabulous because I read it multiple times. And for which she was the recipient of the 2024 Outstanding Achievement in a STEM Educational Doctor Award. I would like to also, before I have Laura take over, I would also like to just say thank you to the South Carolina Middle Grades Initiative, who do provide the funding for our webinars. With that, Dr. Boyle, would you like to go ahead and take it over?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you so much for asking me to be here. This is really exciting. I'm going to share my screen if that is okay. So, all right. So I did my dissertation work on equitable grading practices. And when I think about this, I just shared this with Dr. Morrison. She was my professor during my qualifying exam, and so my very first uh, chapter, my very first draft, the title was "We Don't Talk About Grading," and I'm not going to punish you with this, but in my head, I sing this to the tune of "We Don't Talk About Bruno," because I had little kids while I was writing that, and they really should have talked about Bruno, and we really should talk about grading much more than we do. And so um, I want to preface this, I guess, a little bit by saying I'm going to avoid certain topics. Like I don't like to talk directly about standards-based grading when I talk about equitable grading practices, because making a switch to standards-based grading is like a district-wide event that requires a shift in how you report grades um, to families, to students, how you organize everything. What I do want to focus on are equitable grading practices that individual teachers can make. And as I was putting all of these slides together, I was also, scrolling through Instagram, and you find all of these teacher accounts where right now there's sort of like this big elephant in the room where this idea of shifting towards more equitable grading practices has sort of turned into this idea of like you can't give less than a 50. And while my district has also implemented that directly after COVID, there's a lot of pushback on that because there's a lot of like, why should I give kids any credit for anything, when they don't do work at all? And while I understand mathematically why that makes sense, um, I want to focus on equitable grading practices that have nothing to do with what you enter into a grade book. And I am more than happy to talk about how I do enter things into the grade book and how I determine actual letter grades. I would like to focus more on the practices that I use in my class to sort of open up conversations about grading, to switch from a counting points perspective to a mastery perspective. And so when I talk about equitable grading, I usually start by going over like just a very quick overview of what grading looked like in the US for the last 100 or so years. Then I like to think about what information grades should actually give us. Why are changes to grading practices important? And what are some possible shifts to make these grades more equitable? And then since I just collected a bunch of data on this, I have actual thoughts from my students after experiencing some of these shifts in grading practices that I'd like to share with you guys, just to sort of wrap everything up. So when we talk about what grading looks like in this country, it's actually changed very little over the last 100 years. So our grading system was actually designed to very quickly communicate to students and to families where students should fall in this industrial setting. Should they be management? Should they be on a line working? So grades were really just used to sort students quickly. They were communicated quickly. So you're talking like one quick letter to indicate how a student is doing overall. And now today, we still see those practices in place, even though there's a shift more in our thinking that we know that all kids can learn, but like it takes a different amount of time. It takes different supports and different structures in place to reach all students. And so our grading system doesn't necessarily reflect those ideas. And we also still have a lot of grading practices that tend to emphasize this idea of accumulating points over time, and other practices that are essentially just like an award for compliance. So if a student is compliant in class and does what you say, they get the points, and then that impacts their grade. But it doesn't necessarily tell you how much a student has learned or what skills a student has acquired. I'm curious what information everyone here thinks that grades should actually provide. So if you are giving a student a grade, what is it that you think a grade should tell a student or a family? And so I have a QR code. I also have a Google Doc I just put the link to. There are 3 of these Jamboards throughout this presentation. And so they're labeled, the links are labeled in that document. If you guys would want to click on that and maybe just share a couple of ideas about what information you think grades should actually provide to students and their families. I'm going to pull it out too, so I can see if anybody shared anything. All right, so 2 responses. The degree to which students have understood concepts and have been able to apply the skills learned, which I totally agree with. Information on the student's strengths and information on the growth areas for next steps in instruction. And I would say that I completely agree with both of those ideas about what our grades should show. Let me go back to sharing my screen again. And so I would say about 10 years ago, I had an administrator come into my school at CPS, and he asked us what our grades actually show and what we want our grades to actually show. What should they be communicating to our students? What should they be communicating to our parents? And as a staff, we agreed that our grades should be telling students what they know and what they can do. So what skills have they acquired? Which of our standards have they mastered? So this idea that these grades are only communicating that information to parents. And so when you look at your grades, if there are things included in your grade book for attendance, for participation, for behavior, for homework, that's not necessarily telling us what students know and what they can do. That's telling us, were they here? Did they actually talk or participate in whichever way you asked them to participate? So did they comply with that ask that you made? In terms of homework, that might tell you if they know what you're asking them to know, or it could tell you if they didn't do it, but you don't know why they didn't do it. Also, they could have possibly done it and got 100, but if they didn't do that work in front of you, you don't necessarily know that that's indicative of what that student knows and can do in class. And so we really sat down and examined like how it was that we were communicating grades to parents, what those grades meant, and how we could be more clear in what we were presenting to students and parents. And so now, especially in science, we have the next generation science standards. And so this is an example of a standard that I use when I teach about ecology and ecosystems. And so this standard has two main parts. So it says that students should be able to evaluate the claims, evidence, and reasoning that the complex interactions in ecosystems maintain relatively consistent numbers and types of organisms in stable conditions, but changing conditions may result in a new ecosystem. And so when I am putting in grades, there are two main things that this standard is addressing. It's, do students understand these interactions in an ecosystem, whether it's competition or predation, but it's also, can students engage in arguments from evidence? So are they able to read a text and from that text determine the interactions that are being described, and can they understand the changes that are occurring within the ecosystem, and then make some predictions about what's going to happen. So it's what students know and what students can do. And that's what my grades should show. Are they able to understand these interactions as described? Are they able to understand how that ecosystem is going to change based on whatever change is presented in the problem? So when I first started teaching, I came into the classroom with no student teaching experience because I went through an alternative cert program aimed at getting teachers into Chicago public schools, especially in high needs areas, which science is considered. And so I had no idea what I was doing. And I thought that I had just like missed out on some key class or some key component in a teacher prep program that discussed grading. And so when I started teaching, I just sort of hit the ground running. I had replaced a teacher that relocated to a different state. I just took over all of his stuff in the middle of the school year and then continued to use those practices for several years after that, not realizing that, in fact, pretty much everybody I was working with was really just repeating the grading practices that they had been exposed to as students. And so when we came to school this new year, this new administration that was really asking us to think about what our grades were telling us, what our grades were telling our students and their families, we did a lot of work in terms of like, what is the benefit to making these changes and to making sure that our grades clearly communicate what students know and can do. And so a few of the reasons that really pushed me in this direction, the first is to reduce implicit bias. So I've always taught at Title I schools. I taught in Chicago public schools for 8 years. And during that time, my school served a population that was about 80% Black students and then about 20% Latino students. At my current district, it is my school is about 70% Latino and then an even split of Black and white students. So in terms of the students that I'm in front of every single day, I don't necessarily look like them. I don't have the same background. And we know that implicit bias happens to everyone. So yes, I'm trying very hard to examine bias that, I have from just, all of my decades living here in the United States. But it is very hard for teachers that don't look like their students to grade in a completely bias-free way. And so when we have categories in our grades that reflect things like effort, participation, behavior, and attendance, essentially there is more room for that bias to creep into the grade, because what participation looks like to me based on my culture and my ethnicity might be very different than what participation looks like for students that have a different culture or a different ethnicity than I have. Additionally, I now have my ESL certification. And so typically anywhere from 30 to 50% of my students are considered English language learners. And some of them are fairly relatively newcomers to the country. And I still have students that are going through their silent period where they're just not talking to anyone in English at all. And so if I'm grading them on participation, then that's going to tank their grade right there simply because they're not comfortable speaking this language yet. And that doesn't reflect what they know or can do in my science class at all. That's reflecting their comfort with this language. Next, it also, making these changes also increases cultural relevance. So one of the main points of culturally relevant pedagogy is this idea of understanding that all students are capable of academic success. And so when we make changes to our grading practices for them to become more equitable, the focus shifts from this accumulation of points to mastery of content and mastery of skills. And the idea there is that students get more time and more support in order to reach that mastery level. So it is not just like, oh, the unit's done, you didn't pass this test, we're moving on without you. We're going to continue to look back to build on what foundation you have, and we're going to keep trying to reach mastery, because I know that you can be successful. You just need more practice. You need an alternative assessment. Maybe you're not going to sit here and do this assessment on your computer. Maybe you and I are going to work together and develop a different type of assessment so that you can reach that mastery level. And then the last big point for me is that we are removing barriers from students that struggle outside of school, and we're providing a supportive environment for both academic and social and emotional learning within our classrooms. So some of the grading practices that I will get into really focus on making sure that we are not holding students accountable for their life outside of school. So not all students can do homework at home. Not all kids have a home. Not all kids have two parents in a home. Not all kids have free time after school because they're taking care of siblings or cousins or friends of the family. Some kids have parents that work second or third shift, and so they don't have an adult there with them to help them and support them in doing their homework. All of these things are outside the control of our students, and so as soon as we start grading them on what their outside life looks like, that's completely outside of their realm of control, and is not something that should be taken into account when we're determining their grade and if they actually know and can do the things that we want them to know and be able to do in our classes. So now I would like you guys, if you could, to let me know if any of those points on the previous slide resonate with you. And I can pull that slide back up. The link again is in the chat to those Jamboards. So again, these are my three main points for what pushed me to make some changes in my grading practices. So I'm curious if anyone else, if any of these points stand out to you, or if there's anything else that you think makes sense in terms of like trying to make our grades more equitable. So I'll pause here. Oh, I like this. Although now I feel like I'm sort of preaching to the choir a little bit. All right. So well, right now you guys are saying that you like these points, especially like not grading students on what happens outside of class, but how do we address these things? Let's see. Matching the assessment purpose and the grading is important. If I grade anything irrelevant to the purpose, then it isn't equitable. We love the idea that we need to be aware of how our students want to share their learning with us. Awesome. So yeah, these are, I think, of all the reasons that somebody could want to sort of navigate changes to their grading practices, these are the three that stand out the most to me by far. And so those were the three things that really pushed me to continue pursuing like this idea of equitable grading in my classes, even when there are things beyond my control. So I said at the beginning, I don't want to talk about standards-based grading, because standards-based grading, to do it as it is intended, is a like whole shift for the district. And so, for example, like I have a son and a daughter that are at the same school together, and my daughter just finished first grade. My son just finished the state-funded Preschool for All program. And so because it is a state-run program, they actually do use a standards-based report card. So my daughter does not. She just uses the regular district grading system. So her report card came home last week, and it was 1 page, and it was, you know, just the list of all of her classes and like a quick comment from her teacher. My 4-year-old, however, received an 8-page report card listing all of the different academic and social emotional standards that they covered throughout that trimester, with detailed comments for each one. Now, we as individual teachers cannot go through and make that change in how we report our grades. In some cases, we don't even have freedom necessarily to even pick our own assessments or determine which assessments are going to be given or when they're going to be given. But there are things that we can do within our classroom to make grading more equitable for our students. And so through my dissertation process, I made 7 major changes to make my grading more equitable. And so the first was to use standards-based learning objectives that I provided every single day. These were important because they were used to tell students what the expectations were for class, but also the criteria for success. So not only did I start every single class by telling kids what we were going to learn and what skills we were going to work on, but how they know that they were successful. And so the expectation was that students wrote down those learning objectives on a tracker at the start of every single class period. Sometimes we had the same objective for a few days in a row, simply because it was like a bigger chunk. Sometimes it was only 1 day. But then as soon as we finished covering that objective, students were given smaller formative assessments based on that standards-based objective. And again, sometimes this was like every day if it was a smaller chunk. Other times we would do a few days of learning and working together, and then they would get the smaller assessment. I call these assessments checkpoints because our grading system, our district-wide grading system, is broken into summative and formative assessments. So I didn't want to call this a formative assessment because within our grading system, formative assessments are actually graded and returned to students and count for 20% of their letter grade. So I just removed that word from the vocabulary and I called these checkpoints. And students didn't ever get a number related to their checkpoint. They would be given it back with feedback from me and either a check or a check plus. If they got a check, they knew they needed to do some more work towards that learning objective. If they got a check plus, then they knew that they had mastered it based on the criteria that I had set when we started that learning objective. I also provided students with a unit tracker at the end of each unit. And so what I would ask them to do is after we had completed a unit and all of their grades were actually in gradebook, they would go through, write down the name of the assessment, they would find their score in our online gradebook system, record it, or if they were out for the day, they would write down that they had a missing and they needed to make it up. They would determine if they needed to do a retake on that test. And if they did need to do a retake, then there was a column for them to explain what work they needed to do in order to qualify for that retake. So the idea is just like, you know, any sport or activity you're doing outside where you go to practice one time or a few times a week, in order to get better, you need to practice in class as well in order to improve. And so then students were given retake work based on their retake needs. And they were given usually a few days to complete that work. And then they had a retake day during the actual class time. So it didn't require students to come in early or stay late because of transportation needs. So I teach mostly freshmen. Freshmen, most of them take the bus or they get driven by a family member. So asking them to come early or late means that they can't rely on their bus transportation, or I'm like impacting their whole family dynamic by requiring a parent to either show up early or to show up late. And so that is, again, something that is outside of their control. So I plan ahead for one retake day for each unit assessment, and it occurs during class time after students have received their retake practice work and after they've had time to complete it. And so this ensures that when they're doing their practice work, I'm there with them so they can ask questions, so that we can review things. So the expectation is not like, oh, you didn't pass it this time, but now you got to study on your own in order to pass it the next time. So I'm still there to help them. And then they're doing their retake during class when they're normally in class already. So there's not like this extra layer of like trying to figure out how they're going to get there to see me. The next change I made is that I do not assign any homework outside of class. So my courses are structured so that students have time in class to get all of their work complete. This is a tricky one sometimes because of current issues that we have in terms of attendance. So I will say that this is probably one of the hardest aspects to plan for, because it does require change in how teachers plan in order to fit work time into class. So there's, I think, the need to really go through standards to really identify which activities, which learning activities are really targeted to the standard, because you may have to pull out things that are fun to do or nice to do in order to kind of get the things that are absolutely necessary, so you have time to work on those things during class. And then I do not grade actual formative assessments. So we do have district created common formative assessments that students have to take. In a regular class in my district, those formative assessments do go into gradebook. I received a waiver from our administration, so I do not have to count those. And so again, students are given feedback on that formative assessment. We go through the formative assessment together as a class. We talk about the correct answers. We talk about the distractors. And so we're really using those as a way to practice before the summative assessment. And it's interesting because I got called out on this in my dissertation a few times by a few different people, because formative traditionally are supposed to be practice, right? It's supposed to be an opportunity for students to practice what they've learned in a very low stakes way, to get feedback from their teacher so that they can make improvements prior to a summative assessment. One of the things that has sort of gotten twisted around, I think, the last few years is that we've really grabbed onto these words formative and summative, and really what they've turned into is quiz and test. And so that's how my district has been treating formative assessments. And so really getting to my kids and telling them that, like, it's like a quiz, but it's not going to hurt your grades. It's not going to help your grades. It's going to tell us how you're doing, and if we need to do more practice together, if I need to pull you individually during advisory. It's just giving them feedback on their learning before they're going to get a grade on it. And then the last change I made was that I made sure that students are given rubrics for all summative projects. And since I teach a lab-based course, they get a rubric for all of their labs as well. Again, this just goes along, it's very similar to the idea of like the learning objectives. I'm telling them exactly what they need to do to be successful before I ask them to do anything, so that they can start their lab and project with a really clear idea of what my expectations for success are, and so that we can be on the same page. And then I often would reference those labs and rubrics while we were filling out the unit trackers. So I would have students come up and talk to me once their unit tracker was complete. And if they needed to redo a lab or they needed to redo a project because they hadn't mastered it, we could sit there and look at their lab and project and look at their tracker and really, or look at their rubric and really figure out what they needed to fix and like what changes needed to be made. So then at the end of the semester, I collected data from students about like, what did you like? What did you not like? How did this help you? How did it not help you? What did you use? What did you not use as a part of my dissertation? And so a few of the things that really made me feel good was this idea of they had a much better idea in terms of their personability and self-awareness of how they were doing in the class at the end. So like when I asked students, like, how does this class make you feel, or how successful do you think you're going to be at the beginning, I had a lot of really unclear answers. Like students really didn't have any idea of what to expect, or couldn't really predict how they thought they were going to do. But at the end of the semester, after giving them like all of this feedback and all of these opportunities for us to really work together on their grades, they had a much better idea of where they stood in the class, what challenged them, what things helped them to be successful. And they were able to very clearly identify like their struggles and their successes throughout the semester. So their self-awareness was just much, much better. And as freshmen, that was really good because it's like, this is sort of setting the bar for like where you're going to go through the rest of high school. Some other things that really stood out, the idea of having a second chance and an opportunity to try again was a big way to show students support and to relieve some of their stress. So especially when we're talking about like big transition years, so like moving into junior high, moving into high school, that's a really stressful time. So most of my students were coming from much smaller 8th grade classes into a high school of 3,500 students. The school I work at looks like a ginormous castle. I have a turret in my classroom. Like it is a castle. It is huge. It is massive. There's tons of people. It's very stressful. Kids are getting lost constantly. It takes a really long time to walk from one building to another. There is a lot of stress involved in making these big transitions. And there's nothing that I can do to help them necessarily like navigate that part of it, but I can show them grace in class by giving them these opportunities to continue learning when they're faced with these stressful situations. And maybe they're able to say, like, I wasn't performing my best in the beginning of the semester. I didn't know who I was going to sit with at lunch. Like, there's just so much outside stuff going on that we can't control and they can't control, but we can control how we talk about these things in our classes, how we approach grading, how we approach this idea of teaching students how to manage their own learning, how to track their own progress, and how to allow for the continuation of learning when they're not successful on their first attempt. And so I'm going to go back to this example that I have. This is the same standard that I put in earlier. So it's all about understanding complex interactions in ecosystems, and being able to use information to like make a prediction about how something is going to change or to explain how something is going to change. So in the grand scheme of things, I care way more about the skill attached to this, which is a literacy skill that students can engage in arguments from evidence. And so this idea that if a student was taking my class and they really struggled with identifying different ecological relationships, obviously I want them to understand those relationships, and I can work on that with them. We can go over more examples. We can do all kinds of different activities to really try to highlight those different examples and what those relationships look like. What I really care about, though, is the skill that they're going to see over and over again throughout my course all year long. And then the skill that they're going to see again next year when they're in their physics class. And that's that they can engage in arguments from evidence. So they can read from a scientific text, they can pull out the important information that they need to answer the question, and then they can formulate an answer that makes sense based on what they have read and what they know about these interactions. And so the biggest change that I've noticed has been since I've been, had my ESL endorsement and the number of ESL learners that I've had in my classes, this idea that you didn't just fail a test and now we're moving on, but like you struggled with this content and this skill, but we're going to sit here and we're going to practice it more until you reach a point where you are successful and have mastered this content. And so I think especially for my students that are not just learning biology, but also learning how to read and write and speak and comprehend English, this has been really, really important for them, that these skills keep popping up. We keep focusing on this until they hit a mastery level, or until they stop showing up, essentially. So like they know that if they're showing up to class, we are going to keep working on this, and they're going to receive more help reaching that mastery level. I don't like to just say that this is super easy and like move on, because this is a really big change. The three biggest challenges that I would say I faced making these changes to my grading practices. Number one, we, like I said before, tend to use points as like a compliance thing, or to use grades as a compliance thing and as a behavior management strategy. So losing points as a behavior management incentive, you have to rely a lot more on relationships that are built with students, and you use those relationships then to hold students accountable for their behavior and for their decisions. So no longer can you say, like, I'm going to give you a missing if you don't do this, or if you're not doing this, what you're supposed to be doing in class, you're not going to get the points. I think a lot of times teachers use that as a fear tactic. They use it to help manage not great behaviors that are occurring in class. And if you're not giving kids points for things, you can't do that. And so it is a big shift in terms of how we build relationships with students and how we use those relationships to hold students accountable, that we're having real conversations with students and addressing behavior separately from grades. So the idea here is that if a grade is only representative of what a student knows and can do, their grade shouldn't be impacted if they're making bad decisions in class. That should be another conversation with the student, with the parent, so that behavior is removed from the grade, because again, it's just pulling in too much bias. So like what disrespect looks like to me could be very different than what disrespect looks like to the students. I would say the second challenge that I faced, again, sort of shifting away from compliance and refocusing on mastery. So really changing the conversations that we're having with the students about like what kind of practice that they need to be doing, if they don't need to be doing practice. I think one of the biggest pushbacks that I see when I talk about, or that I hear when I talk about equitable grading, is it does come from this idea of like students get a 50% even if they don't do something. And I know that can sound very frustrating, but I always sort of respond with, but how did they do on the test? How did they do on the summative assessment? Because if a student demonstrates that they know what they're doing on a summative assessment, then the question is, did they need to do the homework in the first place? If a student can demonstrate mastery and we're just loading them up with more and more practice work, more and more homework, the value is not there in that homework or that practice work. At that point, you're just giving kids busy work, and you're keeping it the same for everyone. And it's not a very personalized learning experience. It's probably not going to be very fun for students. So instead, really shifting focus to mastery. If a kid knows this, like what's something new and fun I can give them that like builds on this topic that they already know about, as opposed to just giving them the same work over and over again. And I know that can be really hard, because sometimes it feels like we're giving students work to do and they're just not doing it. And so it can feel like they're being disrespectful, or they're not listening, or they don't care. But in reality, they know it already. And so then what can we do to push them even further? And then the last challenge is just the time to implement change. In general, like any change in our practices or policies, but along with how our timing changes in class. So it does require a change in planning, because you are trying to make sure that you are allowing time in class for classwork to happen, and you're not assigning homework. You have to make sure that you are allowing time to talk about how students are progressing towards mastery in class with everyone. You have to allow time for retake work. And then you have to allow time for retakes to occur in class to make sure that they are like accessible to everyone. Because as soon as you start to change it so it's before or after school, some students are going to lose access to those retakes. And so that timing it does change how you plan, and it changes how long it takes to get through material. All right. So what concerns would you have if you were making a change in your grading practices? So if you were thinking about making a change and you wanted to do use some more equitable practices, what do you think would be the biggest concern that you have? I'm curious to hear about that. So I'm going to pause here. And if you guys don't want to like write in the Jamboard, I've been talking for a long time. I would love to have other people talk.
So I'm happy to share. Something I really, really liked, and I put it in the comment, is you were able to talk to administration and say, I want to do it this way and this is how it looks. And so I teach in higher education, but we not only do we have we're a course alike model. So we have very similar assignments, except for me. I always seem to do something different. But when we have that, we still have very specific grades, especially for our undergraduates. And even when there's pushback, like it's either like, okay, well, you can do this as a participation grade or, the content grade. I'm like, but we need this in between. We need to talk about it. And we need to talk about like, what's the point of the grade? And not only what's the point of the grade, like you talked about these revisions and the ability to be able to go back and strengthen. And that's what I always tell the students I'm working with, the teachers I work with, like, I want to know what they can demonstrate they've learned. I don't care how long it takes to get there, because that's what's the priority, not giving them an F in the beginning. And so I think that, but when I talk about that to my colleagues, in any situation I've been in, I've worked in different settings, it's always, well, that's time consuming. I don't want to take the time. Like, yeah, but it's about the students, not about us. I mean, or there's a happy medium. Maybe you're assigning too many things.
I get a lot of questions about, but how do I have the time to do all of this? How do I grade all the retakes? I grade literally nothing except for summative assessments. I give feedback on the daily objectives, but that's like such a small chunk. And I've got colleagues that do get really wrapped up in like, I grade every single assignment, and they put it in gradebook. But it's like you could be saving all of that time and doing something that's a little bit more streamlined and still giving students this helpful feedback, and really like pushing them to keep going.
I've always had, when I've heard about these kind of practices before, difficulty translating it into an English classroom. Because when I've heard about it, I've mostly heard about it in other kinds of classrooms, science, math, things like that. So for instance, talking about participation, well, some of our English standards are speaking and listening. And so, thinking about grading on something like mastery, that in particular, I find difficult because participation is kind of part of the standards, depending on how you're thinking about it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if your standards are speaking and listening.
So I teach biology, so not my standards are not really. But when I was at my school in CPS, there were a group of pilot teachers, and so there were teachers from every single department. I do know that the departments that pushed back the most and had the most concerns were English and foreign language, because again, the idea is that like if you're in Spanish class, you are speaking in Spanish, or if you're in French, you're speaking in French, because like that's how you learn, right? Is like you practice speaking the language. And so I think sort of essentially what happened in those departments was a focus on removing the participation grade, and it was a shift to like how they like, I think it was like they were breaking kids into groups. And so like if it was like a formative assessment that wasn't graded, the kids would have their assignment, they would have a prompt to speak about, and the teacher would just go from group to group. And if a student didn't participate in the formative, then they would get that feedback. And then there was a speaking portion to the summative. And so there was that chance to grade them on it during the summative. And I will say, I think in terms of that, it's a learning experience for kids, right? So it's like, I've got kids that they find out that like, I'm not putting a grade in for their homework. And so they spend the whole first unit doing nothing. That they're going to turn, they don't do any of the practice work in class because it's not graded, but then they find out that they have not mastered something. And so then they now have to, sorry, my headphones are dying. They find out that they then have to redo everything, and that becomes a real issue for them. And they kind of learn after the first like unit or two that like, oh, okay, I actually have to participate in this because this is going to be the practice. But again, it's a little bit of a learning curve. I use this in my AP class as well. I think my seniors learn a lot faster, that they have to get all the work done. My freshmen, they're 14 when they come in, so like they're not, you know, super on it right away, but they figure it out.
With the checkpoints, so I'm picturing, you know, doing something like this in my class, and I'm a really slow grader. I think maybe English teachers tend to be really slow graders because of all the essays. Um, but thinking about getting feedback to parents quickly. So I really like the idea of the checkpoints and students are getting feedback very frequently and just it's just not graded.
Mhm.
Does that checkpoint feedback get to parents in any way?
When I was at my school in Chicago, I put the we had a different great like computer software. We had a few more options in terms of like what we could put in. And so like I could put in a daily formative, and I could put in like I think it was just like a plus or a minus. So I could give like that really fast feedback. I don't have the ability to do that in my current district. Um, so what I've been doing, I would say typically my checkpoints are like on a half sheet of paper. I just like will pass out like little tiny strips of like notebook paper to students because it's such a quick response. Like if we're doing like, let's say Punnett squares, like I can pretty quickly go through a Punnett square and like circle where they've missed, or if they put the wrong parent genotypes or their percentages are wrong. Like that kind of notation is like very quick to check in. And so I can give that back to them like right at the start of the following class period. Don't have necessarily a great way to give that kind of information to parents. But I do have students track their own checkpoints. So like they write down their objective for the day, and sometimes it's 3 days, and so they just draw an arrow down, and then I give them that checkpoint back, and there's a column next to where they wrote their objective for them to put like a check plus, and then a column for them to write feedback. So like if they're not determining their phenotypic percentages correctly, then they can write that in there, like that my feedback was something about phenotype percentages. So I have a way that I've sort of worked out for them to get their feedback and to record that feedback, but that doesn't necessarily go to the parents yet.
And what do you do with students who, during your days where you're having them do I can't remember what phrase you used for it, but when they're preparing for a retake and they do the like retake work, um, do you have students who don't need to take retakes? And what
Mm-hmm.
do they do during that time in class? And does it become a behavior management issue?
So typically, the students, because this is like generally occurring at the end of one unit and the beginning of another unit, I do a lot of preloading, like, or front loading vocabulary, simply because I have so many ESL kids, and there's tons of new like academic vocabulary and technical vocabulary on top of everything else that they're learning. So a lot of times I will front load vocab, and everybody will do the tracker together, and then that takes up, I would say, like a quarter to a third of the class period, just them like going through their grades, me having conversation with everyone. And then if you need to do practice work, you're given your practice work. If not, sometimes you're given extra time to do your vocabulary. Sometimes I'll have like an ed puzzle to introduce a new topic, or to kind of give them like more of an extension. So it's not something that's like necessarily graded, or something that's going to, I feel like a lot of times like we have kids that do really well, and so like we give them more work. And I don't want to necessarily fall into that either. So it's more of like an extension for something that they've showed interest in that is related to what we're doing in class, or just like a little bit of extra time to maybe complete the vocab ahead of time, or something along those lines. I would say it's usually only like a part of a class where this is like super impactful, and then outside of that, like they're pretty much on track.
And what do your class sizes look like?
It depends. So like I had a class of 21, but I also had 3 classes of like 30 plus this past year. So I would say I usually end up with like just one smaller class period, just sort of off for whatever reason. Our class sizes technically are supposed to be limited to 28, but based on our contract, we can have up to 155 students a day throughout our 5 classes. And so, you know, sometimes we have classes that are like 36, but then I've got to, you know, I'll have another class that's like 22. So I don't hit that 155, but I often have classes, like individual classes that are really large. That's actually, I think, the hardest part, is because like that class of 22 is going to go so much faster than that class of like 36. And so actually keeping my 2 classes on pace together is actually more difficult than, I would say, keeping one entire class together. Let's see. I don't, oh, that was my last slide that I had before with the question. But I've got a list of references up here. If anyone is curious about reading more about equitable grading practices that are sort of more about classroom practices in general than about actually assigning letter grades, but just ways that we can, you know, make things a little bit more equitable for our students. Yeah. Any other questions? I could talk about grading all day. I know we don't talk about grading in general, but I could talk about it forever.
I really appreciated this. You know, in May, we had a panel of teachers that talked about equitable assessment and why we need to think about it that way. And so you kind of bridge that conversation, but also to, you know, this assessment piece and what does that mean for how we're going to grade and for it to be appropriate grading. And, you know, gave ideas for people that are listening, or for Brooke, to what does this look like and how do we transition this. And so I really appreciate this. I definitely want space. Brooke, if you have some additional questions, I want you get the whole floor to be able to kind of center this if you'd like.
I think I asked the majority of my questions and then I just deleted my notes. So wait, hold on. Let me see if I can get them. Oh, I did. Okay, let's see. Oh, actually, I did have one more. So one idea behind grading homework, even if that homework is done in class, for me, has been about students who don't perform well on tests, like test anxiety, things like that. It's a way for students to, I guess, kind of demonstrate mastery in other ways. That's not a formal assessment. So how does that fall on that like dichotomy between grading compliance and actually something that's meant to help students show mastery in different ways? Or how do you draw that distinction?
So I have a decent number of students, especially with my current population, that struggle a lot with our assessments. Our assessments were created within our district, and so they're storylines. And currently, our units are sort of chunked. They're cut in half. We did that with COVID because it was just easier to like recover half of a unit, and then, you know, like absences were crazy. And so there's a reading and a writing component on all of our tests, and then there's a multiple choice component on all of our tests. Given like my student population, I definitely do have students that struggle more with the reading and the writing. But if I read the test to them, they're able to provide an answer and they can, you know, just talk to me about it. And so I found that either having those sort of like conversations as a summative assessment is like a good way to sort of bridge that for students who know what they're doing but are getting caught up on like how to, you know, like they're translating, they're reading it in English, they're translating into Spanish, and then they're thinking of their answer in Spanish, and then they're trying to translate their answer into English, and they're trying to type it out, and there's a time frame, and it can be really stressful, right? It feels very high stakes in the moment. But having conversations with kids, talking them through it, getting their answer, like their verbal answers from them, has been huge, because I have lots of kids that can very clearly articulate the answer correctly, but they struggle with it in that testing setting. And so I found that to be really helpful. And again, like just the idea of retakes in general, and this idea that like I didn't do it yet, but like I still have more time, I still have more chances, I think has also reduced stress quite a bit. And it also means I don't have to rely on homework. And it gives me the opportunity to use classwork as a way to review because I'm not counting that as a grade either. So like anything that we do together in class, either we are like literally doing it together at the beginning, or they're working like with their group or their partner. And then they'll kind of work on some stuff on their own. But at the end, we have the opportunity to review everything. So like they can go through and check their answers. And again, it sort of gives them a way to like up their confidence if they get stuff right. Sorry, my dog is going to bark soon. I think my husband just got home.
We have time for maybe one more. So Brooke, if you have one more, we have this open for you.
What have you done when you've encountered a student who, with all these practices, just simply will not do the classwork, is not performing well, does not seem to want to fix that in any way?
I think I would say this last school year was probably like the most I've seen that, but we also had the worst attendance that we've ever had. Like COVID did a number on my district and a lot of districts, right? Like our absenteeism rate was like up around 58%. Honestly, a lot of those behaviors that we've had have been tied to like pretty major social and emotional issues that students are experiencing outside of class. Like my stance on this is like my class should probably not be your top priority then. If there is an issue that is like impacting you so severely that you're not coming to school regularly, that you are, going to see your social worker multiple times a week, you're going to see your counselor multiple times a week, we've put you into a support group for whatever issues that you're having. I'm more than happy to work with you. I'm more than happy to extend like these retake opportunities for you. I can give you an incomplete at the end of the semester if you want to come back and work on it. But at the end of the day, they have opportunities outside of my class to recover the credit. And we just had a lot of students go through a lot of really severe trauma the last few years within our district. And so typically the students that are doing those things that aren't doing anything fall into that category. In which case, like, I would rather them be healthy, if that makes sense. I feel like that might be a little bit of a cop-out answer, but that's been my experience lately. So because of all the opportunities that they're given, most students are able to demonstrate mastery on at least some of the stuff that we're doing in class because of, like as long as they're there sometimes. And then for those kids that aren't, I just think they've got things going on outside of class that are beyond their control. And, that's probably needs to be their top priority at the time.
I don't ever do a plug for my own stuff. But I definitely think, a lot of what you talked about, it connects to trauma sensitive literacy. Brooke has a piece in a book that I have on trauma sensitive literacy. Brooke, you're in there, aren't you? Yes, I thought so. And so I think that, that connection and that answer is not a cop out. It's true. And so a lot of the things that you provided and you're doing, it's misleading to say trauma sensitive literacy practices because it's not just literacy like reading and writing, it's that learning, the engagement, and all of that. And so, you've connected to that. So your response makes sense. And maybe that's something that if this is prominent in your school, they might want to, invest a little bit into some of that work.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm happy to come out, just saying.
Try to plan accordingly. We get much colder here than you guys get down there.
Where are you at again?
Just outside Chicago.
I mean, I went and presented in Detroit, outside of Detroit last April. We started with March and I was like, that's a little cool. So we ended up in like April.
You really want to shoot for like September, October, May. That's like the sweet spot during the school year.
Hey, look, whenever you all want, I am happy to.
All right.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.
Though. Oh, did somebody stop it? Oh no, there it is.